As people, we tend to sort things into binary systems. Even our computers operate like this. Good and bad, left and right, and for the sake of this video, Apple and Microsoft. These two companies may be the most well-known rivals in the world of business, next to Coke and Pepsi, McDonald's and Burger King, or even Nike and Adidas. In the general public's perception, they are rivals, but if you dig deeper, you'll see that these two companies are intertwined and exist in a yin-yang relationship. In today's video, I intend to go over the history of Microsoft products on Mac and Apple products on Windows. Before we get started here, I'd like to thank the channel members for making this content possible. To start, let's bring this video back to the basics and talk about BASIC. BASIC was a very early programming language, and one can make the argument that it was a sort of early operating system, but I wouldn't. BASIC was created in the mid-1960s at Dartmouth. Microsoft, however, was largely responsible for its distribution across the early computers of the late 1970s and early 1980s. The most famous line of computers that ran BASIC was the Commodore 8-bit line of machines, from the PET to the Commodore 128. Another famous machine that ran BASIC was the Apple II. At this point in history, Apple and Microsoft were not very big rivals at all. In fact, Microsoft was a software company and Apple was a hardware company. In understanding why Microsoft BASIC was on the Apple II, we have to take a look at Steve Wozniak. The Woz was an expert programmer and created his own version of BASIC for the Apple II. This version of BASIC, however, lacked everything he didn't care for, like floating point arithmetic. Woz did this because he saw computers as a hobby and a fun way to play games. But not all customers saw it this way, and they wanted those functions as well. After all, the Commodore PET had these features, so Steve Jobs, wanting his customers to buy this machine and not the competition's machines, went to Bill Gates and Microsoft for a license to use BASIC on the Apple II. Microsoft sold them the license, and that's how we got AppleSoft BASIC on the Apple II. Apple did not give anything to Microsoft in return except for a pile of cash. The status quo remained until the release of the Macintosh in 1984. Microsoft released software early into the Mac's life, like Word, Chart, and Multiplan. Microsoft invested heavily in the Mac and took advantage of the GUI. Now, since Microsoft was working on software before the Mac's release, Microsoft had some early prototypes to run their software on. And this is where the story gets interesting. Microsoft didn't just make their apps run on the Mac, but they also studied how the GUI worked. Microsoft took what they learned from the Mac at this time and then created Windows 1.0. Understandably, Steve Jobs was pissed when this happened. Steve Jobs claimed that Bill Gates stole the idea of the GUI and implemented it into their own product. And Bill Gates denied this, and he also placed the blame back on Steve Jobs. As for some background context, Steve Jobs took a visit to Xerox in the late 1970s. Xerox at the Palo Alto Research Center was working on a ton of different stuff at this time, like Ethernet, but the main attraction to Steve Jobs was the GUI. Steve Jobs took this idea of the user interface with bitmap graphics and implemented it into the Macintosh. Bill Gates saw it as Steve Jobs and himself were both stealing from Xerox, so that made it okay. Bill Gates had this to say about the whole deal.
I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal a TV set and found that you had already stolen it.
It's my best impersonation of Bill Gates. Now, this moves on to legal issues. Apple didn't want to sue Microsoft until 1988, which was 3 years after this ordeal started. Why didn't Apple just sue them? Well, Microsoft had some great leverage here, and this was Microsoft Excel. Microsoft said that if Apple sued, then they would stop work on Excel for the Mac. Well, Excel was a very popular app and a great piece of software on the Mac, and killing it meant killing the Mac. John Scully signed a deal with Microsoft that for Excel on the Mac, then Windows 1.0 would be protected. Microsoft took this to mean that all future versions of Windows were also protected. In 1989, Apple finally took Microsoft to court for over just under 200 GUI elements they claimed were stolen in Windows 2.0. The judge tossed the case out since it was bogus, and technically the GUI wasn't Apple's idea either. Xerox then struck Apple with a lawsuit to claim their share of the GUI pie. In 1994, the Court of Appeals ruled in favor of Microsoft, stating that Apple's look and feel is not protected. In 1995, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. In this time period, however, there actually was some Mac software on Windows. Apple decided to spin off its software division into another company called Claris. Software like FileMaker Pro was ported to Windows, and Claris Works was also ported to Windows. Some of the multimedia wars also started to take place at this time, with QuickTime. In 1992, Apple knew that if they wanted QuickTime to be the standard in multimedia, then they would need to release it on PCs, since that was the majority of the market. Funny enough, there was more drama with this port as well. Apple hired a company called San Francisco Canon to port the software, and they did. Microsoft then hired the exact same company to make their Video for Windows project. Microsoft used a lot of the code from QuickTime to speed up their own video software project, and this incident was actually used by Steve Jobs in 1997 for the New Deal with Microsoft. Speaking of Steve Jobs, what happened to Steve Jobs at this time? Well, Steve Jobs was off at Next and Pixar. Since Pixar does not really matter for this video, we are going to skip over that, but Next does matter, and this is because there was absolutely no Microsoft products on the Next platform. Steve Jobs really disliked Bill Gates at this time, and there was no real reason to put Microsoft products on the Next platform. Back at Apple in 1992, there was a secret project running called Project Star Trek, and this was to port System 7 onto an Intel-based PC. If you want to hear more about that, then check out the video I did a few months back on the Intel switch. Microsoft had a huge threat coming its way, however, and it wasn't another computer company or Y2K. In fact, it was something incredibly dangerous: the United States government. There exist these things called monopolies, and the United States government is not a fan of monopolies. In fact, they don't like monopolies so much that they'll forcibly break up companies that are doing so well that they manage to become the entire market. The most famous case of the United States government breaking up a tech company was Bell, known today as AT&T. This is why we have different phone companies in the United States today. They exist because Bell's broken up. Microsoft knew this. Hell, everybody knew it once their phone company changed. But Microsoft did not want that to happen to them. Around the same time, Steve Jobs was back at Apple after Apple bought out Next. Apple was in the gutter and was about 90 days to bankruptcy. Steve Jobs, being the businessman that he was, made a deal with Microsoft. Microsoft was to give $150 million to Apple in exchange for the government to quit breathing down their neck and to avoid a potential lawsuit from Apple over the stolen code. In exchange, Apple accepted the deal of having Internet Explorer be the default browser on macOS, and a 5-year deal to have Microsoft Office on the Mac.
And it needs help from other partners. It needs to help other partners. And relationships that are destructive don't help anybody in this industry as it is today. So during the last several weeks, we have looked at some of the relationships, and one has stood out as a relationship that hasn't been going so well, but had the potential, I think, to be great for both companies. And I'd like to announce one of our first partnerships today, a very, very meaningful one, and that is one with Microsoft. I'd like to take you through this. The discussions actually began because there were some patent disputes. The second part of this is Microsoft is committing to release Microsoft Office on Macintosh for the next 5 years. They are going to release the same number of major releases as they release on Windows during that time. Their first release is they're going to target to have it out near the end of the year. It might slip a few months into next year, but they're working real hard on it, and it looks very, very good. Next, we have taken a look at browsers out there, and Apple has decided to make Internet Explorer its default browser on the Macintosh. Since we believe in choice, we're going to be shipping other Internet browsers as well on the Macintosh, and the user can, of course, change their default should they choose to. But we believe that Internet Explorer is a really good browser, and we think it's going to make a fine default browser. And lastly, Microsoft is making an investment in Apple. Microsoft is buying $150 million worth of Apple stock at market price. It is non-voting shares, and they've agreed not to sell them for at least 3 years. So what this means is that Microsoft is going to be part of the game with us as we restore this company back to health, have a vested interest in that stock price going up. We're going to be working together on Microsoft.
As you can tell, this had a very mixed reaction. Nobody wanted to use Internet Explorer, but yet again, Microsoft did just save Apple from bankruptcy. From 2000 to 2010, Apple had also put a number of its own software on Windows, the most famous being QuickTime and iTunes. Now, QuickTime, we already talked about, had been on Windows since the 1990s, but saw heavy improvement in that time. iTunes, however, was a newcomer, and this software was necessary to use an iPod. iTunes' release on Windows happened in 2003, and allowed users with iPods who didn't have a Mac to sync their music onto just be able to sync it on Windows. A theme that I noticed is recurring with a lot of this Apple software on Windows was to allow their hardware to be used on a Windows machine. Airport Utility was also released on Windows, as well as iDisk and MobileMe services. Safari was also released on Windows, and it had some of Apple's own cores for rendering, so it looked as if the Mac version of the app was running perfectly on Windows, which was probably a very weird sight. This was discontinued in 2012. Some other networking services like Bonjour, the replacement for Apple Talk, was also ported onto Windows. Shake, which was a super high-end compositing software for films, was bought out by Apple and continued to be sold on Windows for a number of years after the purchase in 2002. This was a Mac-exclusive app in 2006 and onward, till it was cancelled. The last and most important software that merged these two worlds together was Boot Camp. Boot Camp was a way for Mac users to run Windows on the Mac. Boot Camp installed all necessary drivers to run Windows natively on the Mac. This only came out because of the Intel switch, and make sure to check out that video if you're interested. Microsoft also put some more of its own software on the Mac. Office, like we already discussed, was given after the deal, but other apps like MSN Messenger, Virtual PC, and Windows Media Player were ported to the Mac. Things really slowed down, however, in the 2010s. iTunes on Windows became too bloated and slow. iCloud was released on Windows, and Safari on Windows was killed off in 2012, like we said. Office 2016 was brought over to Mac, and Microsoft Edge was also ported to the Mac. iTunes is still on Windows today, but it's actually not on the Mac, which is pretty weird when you think about it. Now, I'd like to touch on this last bit of software for Windows that was just never ported over, and this is Microsoft Access. Access is a database tool. Think, if Excel is a single file, then Access is the filing cabinet. Now, as you watch over this terrible B-roll of Microsoft Access, let me tell you why this was never brought over to the Mac. Access is a huge piece of software, and its code is old and long. A lot of the code is tied deeply to Windows itself. The cost of rewriting Access is too high for the potential amount of profits that it could have on the Mac if it was even on there. I hope this is making sense to you all. As of 2026, there is no financial incentive to port Access to Mac, since the costs associated with porting it over to Mac do not cover the returns for porting it over to Mac. And that leaves us with today. Ever since the Apple Silicon switch, boot camp is essentially over, and the lineup of Microsoft apps on Apple computers are essentially the Microsoft Office suite of apps, Teams, Outlook, and some other ones that I completely do not know of. Funny enough, there really isn't anything being currently supported at the moment on Windows from Apple. I hope you all enjoyed this video. I'd like to get to 4,000 subscribers by April of this year, so it would be greatly appreciated if you guys would help me out with that goal. Until next time, goodbye.